Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for our forum on inclusive prosperity through innovation and entrepreneurship. My name is Ozkal, and I'm a senior program officer focusing on the future of work and declining business dynamism here at the Kauffman Foundation. In this forum, we will discuss research, policies, and programs at the intersection of innovation, entrepreneurship, and inclusive prosperity. Innovations big and small are all around us. The journey from idea to implementation is not an easy one. Beyond perseverance, it typically requires money and luck. There are also systemic barriers that limits the ability to go from idea to impact. These inequities could be stated in many terms, but noted economist Dr. Elise Shaw captured this point concisely on NPR's Planet Money when she shared that 1899 was the peak year for African-American patents per capita. So, who are America's innovators? How do we ensure all would-be innovators and entrepreneurs have access to grow their ideas? We have two exciting panels to get at these answers. First, we will begin with a panel discussion on what we know about innovation and its connection to entrepreneurship. Our panelists will highlight what research work has been done on this topic. What are the gaps in our knowledge and discuss opportunities for further inquiry. In our second panel, we will hear more about how to design equitable innovation programs and policies. And after each panel, we'll have a moderated Q&A, and I would encourage you to send in your questions to us in the Q&A box throughout the presentations. Our speakers today come from a variety of backgrounds in research, policy, the nonprofit world, and more. They will cover a broad spectrum of research and policy questions. I would like to thank each of today's participants for taking the time to share their insights with us. The entrepreneurship issue forums provide an opportunity for research and practice to come together to share evidence and insights and learn from one another on specific topics related to entrepreneurship. The Kauffman Foundation does not take a political position or legislative position on these discussions. We're first going to start by learning more about innovation and how it relates to entrepreneurship. For our first panel, we have Professor Kristina McElheran, Assistant Professor of Strategy Management at the University of Toronto. And we'll hear from Dr. Vivienne Ming, professional mad scientist and co-founder of Sokos Labs. And then Ms. Elise Shaw, Study Director, Institute for Women's Policy and Research. For our second panel, we'll hear from Dr. Alex Bell, postdoctoral scholar, California Policy Lab at UCLA, and Professor Matt Marx at Cornell University. And we'll have our moderation from Dr. William Duncan, Assistant Professor of Mathematics and Statistics at Baker University. We will have each of our panelists give a presentation before moving to a question and answer period. So without further ado, please welcome our first panelist, Professor Kristina McElheran.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here and to share with you some of my very recent research and some of my prospective and upcoming research. So I will dive right in. I'm very much looking forward to all of your questions, and I have some questions and some requests for the audience as well. All right, so the research I'm going to highlight for you today focuses on cloud computing, which I think is pretty well understood now, but I started looking into the historical data and trying to find what was going on with this in the very early days of its diffusion. And there's some exciting implications for innovation, entrepreneurship, economic dynamism. The paper is long and detailed and available on SSRN and on my website, which I'll show a link to. And I'm just going to hit some of the highlights and get into some of the new and exciting things coming up, because I think the door is starting to open for how we can use technology to improve economic dynamism, innovation, and inclusive innovation in a lot of interesting ways. All right, so a lot of my work is in collaboration with the US Census Bureau and leans on non-public data. So I have to put my disclaimer that everything I'm going to show you has been vetted, so no proprietary firm information will be revealed. The key motivation for this whole agenda really is quite well summarized in this work by John Haltuwanger, Ron Jarman, and co-authors, where they go into the detailed manufacturing data and look at how important young firms are for economic growth and dynamism. And there's this increasing concern that we're losing our dynamism engine, that the young and the small firms that really are important to drive growth, you can see here in the blue, the net job creation is much higher in the early stages of a firm's life, but that we also lose a lot of jobs through exit. And so what we want to know in this research is, has this shifted at all over time through technological change? And we have some preliminary evidence as we look in more recent years of the longitudinal business database, and we can see this sort of inflection point where, while the young firms have been declining over time very significantly, in some recent years, there seems to be this potential, intriguing, hopeful resurgence of participation by the young and the small. And we think that this could be in part due to the rise of cloud computing. So for those who've been living under a rock or just not really interested in tech, no sooner than 2006, but very quickly afterwards, we saw this introduction of outsourced purchased IT services in the cloud. And so if that is still a bit of news to you, I'm just going to briefly highlight that this is on-demand computing through the internet. It is a turnkey solution that can be rapidly provisioned, theoretically, with minimal managerial effort, though the jury's a little bit out on that, because there's certainly always some co-invention and adjustment when new technology comes through. And really about 2009, the availability of these high capacity networks, the rapid decrease in the cost of compute and storage, and then lots of other stuff about containers and virtualization that I won't drag you into, really led to this growth, this really rapid growth from 2009, 2010 on in cloud computing. And you can also see this if you look in like the Google Trends data, the search trends, you can see this really, really fast uptick around 2009 and in searches related to the cloud. So the reason we think this matters for the topic of the day is that, as I'm sure most of you know, the young are quite different from established older incumbents in a few key dimensions. So we know for sure they face higher uncertainty of all kinds. Often we refer to this as Knightian uncertainty, because we don't even know, there's the known unknowns, and then there's the unknown unknowns, and there's all these open questions and variants that entrepreneurial firms face. We know that one of the key approaches to dealing with this fundamental uncertainty is to experiment. And we have some wonderful research by pals of mine and former colleagues at Harvard looking at how experimentation helps young firms. And we know that young firms are very resource constrained. So we know that they have these fundamental differences vis-a-vis the incumbents. A challenge for people like me who conduct empirical research is they are also hard to see and hard to track, and they're missing from many standard data sets. And so this is why I, with my co-author on this particular project, Wang Jin, who's at the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy, went into the census data where the firms are tracked in detail over time and in very representative samples. All right, so the young are different from the old. Well, the cloud is different from traditional IT. It is elastic. It can be expanded on demand in a way that traditional IT can't. And it is also really fast to do this. You can scale it up and you can scale it down. The trade-off here, and this will matter if you start to compare the young and the old, which we do in detail in the paper, and I'm not going to go too far into the weeds here this morning, but that it's slightly generic. But what this means is that with this change in the way that IT can be provisioned to firms, we have this hope of democratization of IT. Have we lowered barriers to entry so that the young and the small can suddenly do things that they can't? And An interesting way to think about this, I'm going to show you a couple trade-offs today, but one is about the trade-off between so this generic on-demand IT. You might want to think about that as going to a restaurant and choosing from a menu versus having your own personal chef. And this is not my analogy. This is from Bruce Schneier at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. But the trade-off here is that you go to the restaurant, you can get anything that's on the menu, but if you wanted something super customized, you're going to have to go more the high cost personal chef route. But for firms that are young and experimenting, generic, fast, elastic may be good enough. And we're going to look at this in the manufacturing sector. Sometimes I have to motivate for people that manufacturing is a very exciting place to look at technological change. There's a lot of use of the cloud and other technologies in manufacturing. There's the infrastructure as a service with storage and compute, which is what most people are familiar with. Increasingly, we have platform as a service where we're seeing apps bundled with products and operating system layers being used by manufacturing firms. And then increasingly, a lot of use of software as a service with enterprise resource planning, supply chain management, and really the whole shebang. And this is just increasing rapidly. So our entree into this is looking through the census data. We use the annual survey of manufacturers. This has some very nice features for capturing all sorts of firms in a very representative fashion because your response to the census is required by law. So this gives us 230,000 establishment year observation, kind of a non-trivial size of data set. We get to see firms from the moment they have their first employee. So we're not seeing the startups in the garage, they're just run by the founders. I'd love to get more insights into that. So that's coming. Let me get to that towards the end of my comments here. But we get to see that all the way to roughly 40 years old when they stopped tracking they didn't start tracking the age far enough back. And so about 18% of our sample then are young. Our definition of young here is 5 or fewer years old. And we get more than 70% of the manufacturing economy in the certainty sample. So we really are seeing what's happening in the sector. So the punchline here is that IT services start to outperform own IT. So the menu approach starts to work better than the personal chef approach once the cloud diffuses and is quite available and affordable. So you can see 2006, 2007, when this is really not a thing, AWS is just introduced, it starts to grow, and then we see this shift where the benefits, the productivity benefits, that's what's here on the y-axis, start to overtake those coming from owned IT capital stock, which is something we've never seen before. And the reason this matters for today is that there's a really significant uneven impact, that this is associated with better survival, better growth, and productivity of young workplaces. And this is at the plant level. So this holds sometimes within established, multi-unit firms as well, and that the young and the small benefit the most. And so if you go back to my original slide, this is super exciting because this area where we saw all this loss through job destruction from exit, we might be able to shift that as the cloud becomes a new platform for firms to use IT, to rapidly experiment, to scale up and scale down without these irreversible commitments. The other thing that's very exciting if we're interested in inclusion is that the adoption of the cloud, for reasons that are not completely transparent to researchers yet, is very much related to the geographic dispersion of cloud services provision. And here I have some older graphs. We probably need to update this, but we were trying to stick to the time frame of our paper. We see this rapid growth in cloud services providers. So this is intensity by county in less agglomerated, less populated areas. So this might create new opportunities for growth, entrepreneurship, and survival in unconventional geographic spaces, which I think is super exciting. And this is one of the directions we want to push this research agenda. So we have been moving the needle to try to understand this better. In 2018, I worked with the Census Bureau to run the annual business survey where we asked more about cloud services. This was 850,000 firms, and was across all of the sectors of the economy. And what we see is that the uptake is very, very high in all sectors. So this is not just a manufacturing phenomenon. We can see this in all sorts of interesting sectors like finance, professional services, even places we might not expect so much like construction. So this is really taking off. And so what I want to do is just foreshadow for you where I'd like to take this agenda, because I think the implications are really, really exciting. So one dimension I'm pushing this is that I have some work with some with census co-authors and with Erling Barth. So Erling Barth, Richard Freeman, Erling's at University of Norway. Richard is at Harvard Law School, and Jim Davis at the Census Bureau. We have a new paper where we are able to show age bias in technological change. And this is with big software investments. So that's the big IT capital types of investments, like to push further and see if this is something that maybe is reversed in the cloud, especially if younger, more dynamic firms are doing this, and also perhaps be more inclusive in how they compensate people. I have a new project with Hyunjin Kim at INSEAD, where we're going to try to use AI to degender job descriptions and see if we can promote more inclusive applications to jobs. And my most recent brainwave has to do with another cloud trade-off, which is that not only do we want to think about the menu versus the chef, but I think we want to think about buses and public facilities versus owning your own cars. So if firms can start to put their compute in the cloud, we can start to leverage economies of scale and the environmental benefits of putting these facilities where electricity is cheap. So it's cheaper to move photons than electrons. You put the compute where the electricity is cheap and maybe cleaner, where we have cooling happening for us in Iceland, and then we just move the compute over high-speed infrastructure. We might actually be able to see some benefits related to what I think is front of mind for many of us, which is the climate crisis. So I would like to push the agenda on here. I'm also going to flag for this group that you might be very excited about an initiative that I was involved in at MIT. I'm a digital fellow at the initiative on the digital economy there, which was the Inclusive Innovation Project. And this was a global tournament for entrepreneurs harnessing technology to ensure a more equitable future. It is now called MIT Solve. But in the first few years when I was involved with it, we had 160 organizations, more than 5 million in prizes. And the winners of this competition generated over 170 million in revenue, over 1 billion in capital, created 7,000 plus jobs, and served 350 million people. And so this competition is really about how can we innovate to bring more people into participation, full participation in the economy. Now MIT Solve is up to over $40 million. So if you are interested, I encourage you to check out that activity as well. I think that's very exciting for the topics that we're going to discuss today. And then finally, I want to take some of this and go after new information. So right now I'm formulating and working on developing a new firm survey of cloud computing. And I'm going to branch out from my Census Bureau collaboration and run this one myself. And one of my key concerns is how to reach the young and the small who maybe aren't already hiring people, or they may come and go very quickly. I want to see how I can capture this very difficult to reach population of firms. So please send me your ideas and your insights on that. And then I'm just really excited to be here and to engage in this conversation. I have a lot of this work on my website if you want to go to KristinaMcElheran.com and download anything there or reach out. I'd love to hear from you all. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor McElheran. So next up is Dr. Vivienne Ming, professional mad scientist and co-founder of Sokos Labs.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful being here. As you perhaps can tell, I got a little thing going in this moment in time is modestly terrifying But frankly, I have always logged my days in how infrequently I didn't have some sort of a cold. So it's terrific being here, particularly on this particular topic, to be a scientist and an entrepreneur. And I've had a fascination with the idea of human potential, and of course, inevitably lost potential from those people that could have been an entrepreneur but didn't become that. They could have researched a subject, developed a patent, a cure, and never had the opportunity. And for me, this began as a very personal experience. I've started 6 companies over my career, and my very first company, my wife and I went out trying to raise money for AI in education, and everybody loved the technology. They loved the idea of it. Changes before Khan Academy and Coursera, but nobody loved the idea of funding my company or me being a CEO. As one VC put it, you can read students' minds. That was as much as people understood about artificial intelligence back then. By the way, not so much better today. And then he followed up with, here's $2 million if you do financial fraud detection, and I've got the perfect CEO for you. Note, I was the CEO sitting across the table from him. I had just been, at least in his own head, fired from my own company whose entire business plan was jettisoned. It's amazing the kind of barriers that not just our economy, but all segments of our society throw up to people that want to innovate and want to create value in our economy. And this, of course, shouldn't be a huge surprise. I'm sure anyone on a call with Kauffman on this subject is well aware of Raj Chetty's Lost Einstein's research. You know, the idea that academically matched kids from the top of the economy are 10 times as likely to generate a patent in their lifetime than matched kids in the middle of the economy. If there was one thing I was led to believe growing up, it was that, hey, maybe America isn't always so great with low SES working class families, but if you were in the middle class, you had the same opportunities. And his research very much calls that into question, and questions makes us wonder what it is we're missing in our lives, this counterfactual universe in which young people around the world have the full opportunity to create value themselves as all the rest of us in what they are creating around the world. Well, again, this is very tangible for me. In my career, I've had the chance not only to build several companies, but I developed the first AI for diabetes. I developed the first artificial intelligence system that can predict manic episodes and bipolar companies. And my most recent company is looking at issues of public health and the ties between chronic stress and ischemic heart disease, among others. And none of that should have happened. Many years ago now, when I was an academic, I went through gender transition and lost my position. No one was really excited about the idea that I would be an entrepreneur. And if you will forgive my brag, I'm a damn good one and have had the chance to build some things I'm incredibly proud of, including philanthropic systems to reunite orphan refugees with their extended family members. So if we look at all of this opportunity that is left on the table, societal alpha, you might call it, I wanted to understand, when we look specifically at high growth entrepreneurship, a story like Raj Chetty's, a story about what is lost and how we might gain it back. So this began as I joined the largest LGBTQ entrepreneurship nonprofit in the world, looking at high growth entrepreneurship. And I led our research projects looking at a number of questions related to traditionally marginalized entrepreneurs. This began with a big data study combined with a survey back in, oh my goodness, it's nearly 8 years ago now. We released the State of LGBT Entrepreneurship report, where, among other things, I went through with help from data from Crunchbase and CB Insights and collected migration data on all entrepreneurs. We had roughly 100,000 identified entrepreneurs. And along that identification, we had their funding rates, their job creation and patent creation rates. And most importantly, we had information on where they grew up and were educated and where they ended up founding their companies. Now, it shouldn't be a surprise to any of us that high growth entrepreneurs tend to leave small and medium-sized cities and migrate out towards large communities that have access to capital and talent. So if we looked at the Census Bureau data from 2005 to 2014, we were able to construct a, let's call it a transition matrix, a migration matrix, looking at how likely an average American was to move from any given state to another. And every state had a transition to every other state, but some were more likely. Certain states net gained, like Texas, Florida, California, during this period of time. For the average entrepreneur, though, certain transitions, such as towards California or towards New York, towards Texas, were much, much more likely. Not a surprise. But when we look specifically at LGBT entrepreneurs, and let's be honest about my data set, we look specifically about gay and lesbian entrepreneurs, as we could identify using models based on Startout's own membership data. About 6,000 people in the original report, we could see that for certain cities, these patterns were greatly exaggerated. Where an average entrepreneur might be 4 times as likely to move to California as the average American, queer entrepreneurs are 12 times as likely to California. Now, you could just assume that these are exaggerated effects, or that they are simply the additive effects, combination of gay and lesbian people being more likely to move towards certain cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, plus being more likely to move as an entrepreneur. But we can actually look at some test cases to see whether this is true. And we find, for example, in Texas, that while the average entrepreneur is much more likely than the average American to move from any state to Texas, queer entrepreneurs are actually less likely to move to Texas than the average entrepreneur. And even then, if we break down Texas into Austin versus Dallas and Houston, we see Austin is a net gainer of gay and lesbian entrepreneurs, where Dallas and Houston are net losers of entrepreneurs. Why is this important? Because those people we were tracking went on to create jobs. In some sense, these states that are losing gay and lesbian entrepreneurs are exporting the jobs that they went on to create towards states that where the companies ended up being founded. So what we estimated was over the same time period, about 2005 to 2014, the entrepreneurs that migrated out of Indiana and Arizona to Washington State and Massachusetts took nearly 3 million jobs with them in the States. And we looked at this difference in migration, the difference between average entrepreneurs and gay and lesbian entrepreneurs, to roughly estimate that about 1.9 million of those jobs could have been created in Indianapolis or in Phoenix or Houston, but instead were created in Seattle or Chicago or Boston instead. Now, nearly 2 million jobs is over 10 years in the grand scheme of the economy is not a drop in the bucket, but these are, keep in mind, the kinds of jobs created by high growth startups, about engineers, high-level managers, design jobs. In fact, the net growth into California from queer entrepreneurs alone compared to job exporting in the form of things like call centers and data centers, not only was net positive for the influx of these high-tech jobs, but the quality of jobs was vastly higher. This is the sort of thing that's missing in trying to understand the impacts and the barriers are having on job and IP creation in traditionally disenfranchised entrepreneurs. Recently, my philanthropic lab, Sokos Labs, again jointly with Start Out, has produced the Inclusion Impact Index. You can see the details of that either at sokos.org or at startout.org. This is a real-time map of over 100 major metros, soon to add in, I believe, 11 metros from Canada, looking at monthly job creation, patent creation, funding rates, exits by all entrepreneurs. So one thing we can track is regional inequality in these output variables from high growth entrepreneurs, but also specifically female entrepreneurs, gay and lesbian entrepreneurs, and very soon, hopefully at the end of this summer, we will also have this broken down by ethnicity, allowing us to look at intersectionality. Just a glance this morning at the index indicates, for example, that of currently active firms, had female entrepreneurs had the same opportunities, not as male entrepreneurs, but female entrepreneurs across all major metros in the United States had the same opportunities as the 3 best performing metros for female entrepreneurship. Then we would have about 1.5 million additional jobs in the economy. This takes into account the rather massive hit women have taken along with other traditionally disenfranchised entrepreneurs in the economy over the last 18 months as funding rates for female entrepreneurs and people of color have dropped rather dramatically compared to overall funding rates for startups. So we have this body of data showing us that there is an opportunity and a hunger to be a part of the economy, to be that kind of dynamic job and innovation creator that is driving so much of the growth in America and around the world. And yet barriers continue to persist and harm the economy collectively. Again, I am sure we would all love to have an additional 1.5 million jobs in the economy right now. We have similar estimates for queer entrepreneurs and looking at interregional inequality in entrepreneurship as well. But I'd like to end actually on another new piece of research, or relatively new, this out of Stanford, by some colleagues doing computational linguistics. And they did something that would be very hard to have done even 5 years ago. They read every dissertation published since 1977. I believe 1.2 million papers. Of course, they read this using machine learning, artificial intelligence. And their AI may in fact be the only thing in the entire world that has ever read my dissertation, because I sure as hell didn't. I know for a fact no one have this system by which they were able to go out and measure in multiple different metrics innovation in these dissertations. And they published a paper titled The Diversity Innovation Paradox, replicating something we've known about our economy for decades and decades. And in science, it is this: the more of an outlier you were in your field, by gender, by ethnicity, and we know this holds along other dimensions as well, the more innovative your research was, the more innovative your dissertation. And yet, the more of an outlier you were in your field, the less likely you were to be cited, and the less likely you were to be promoted at every stage of academic advancement, from graduate student to postdoc to junior faculty and up through tenure. People that are different are delivering exactly what our economy needs, and still in 2021, receiving only a fraction of the benefit of their contribution, which means inevitably we are not receiving the full benefit of their contribution and their capabilities. As someone that's had a lot of good fortune in her life and holds it deep in my heart that I've had these opportunities, I want to see that. I want to see someone come up with a cure for COVID or for diabetes for my son. I want to see people create companies that bring real change into our lives. And the vast majority on the people of this planet will not have that opportunity and don't today, regardless of how many awards we lay out in front of them or how much we tell ourselves, I manage $1 billion fund and I only ever make rational decisions. Until we recognize that parts of our brain are poorly wired for trusting people that are different than us, we'll never be able to move forward on this. And I encourage you to check out some new review research we've done here at Sokos Labs on the neuroscience of trust, particularly the effects of in-group and out-group trust, and how our very brains work against us in seeing the value of people in out-groups. So I hope this doesn't come across as pessimistic, because I believe in a world where my kids grow up with the benefits of the discovery of so many more people that are able to contribute today. And I hope we can see the value of all those missing jobs and all of those missing patents and move beyond our current practices and think about what it takes to create true equity for all of us in the outcomes of high growth entrepreneurship. So much, and if there are questions, I look forward to having to chat about them during the panel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ming. So as we turn now, let's move to our next panelist, Elise Shaw. Please take it away.
Hi, thank you so much for having me to speak today. I really think that innovation is one of the hallmarks of our American culture. But women and people of color are woefully underrepresented as inventors. And I really truly feel that a greater diversity of perspectives is essential to ensure that we discover the solutions to some of the world's biggest challenges, stuff that we're seeing today: global pandemics, food insecurity, climate change. The solutions and ideas are out there. The experts that we need are there. We just have to ensure that everyone has access to the supports and the resources and the information needed to bring their ideas to reality. So as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about this issue. I've been working at the Institute for Women's Policy Research on this very topic for about 6 years now. We've been doing research on the gender and racial patenting gaps for a while. We have a whole host of research in this area, so I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the kind of key findings from IWPR's prior and most recent research on this topic. Specifically, again, like I said, focusing on gender and racial gaps. This is going to be a very high-level overview, so please visit iwpr.org to find these reports. They're all there. It goes much more in depth than I'll get into today. But first, I'm going to start with a little bit of our data on the gender gap in patenting. We looked at what's going on for women, and while there's been progress in women's representation among patent holders, most of this progress happened in the 1980s and the 1990s. So by 2010, only 19% of patents had at least one woman listed as an inventor. And this has only grown to 21.9% by 2019, according to the latest USPTO report. This is progress, but at an extremely slow and glacial pace. So according to analysis, if the rate of progress kind of remains the same, we won't see gender parity on patents for anywhere from 70 to 100 years. So in other words, sometime between 2091 and 2121. That is way too long to wait in my mind. I'll go on to say that this is data for all women, as best as we can get it. The USPTO actually does not currently collect demographic data on patent applicants and grantees, so us researchers use algorithms to do best guess gender match by name. So we'll have some losses there. It's not going to be 100% accurate, this data. And as Derek mentioned earlier, these algorithms also show that patenting activity by Black inventors peaked in 1899. So this is insane to think about. And this is even as Black and Hispanic graduates patent at half the rate of white college graduates when we look at this in the college level. Because we don't have the demographic data, we don't have specific intersectional analysis for women of color. Given the challenges people of color face in innovation and patenting from what data we do have, and the multiple overlapping race and gender barriers women of color face in the workplace and society, we can safely assume that women of color probably are on patents at a much lower rate than white women. So there's probably an even larger gap there. Again, we would love to have this data to actually know, but we don't right now. And so at IWPR, we said, why does this matter? A lot of people say patenting, that seems like such a niche topic, but it's not. It's so interconnected to so many things, as you've heard. Innovation and patenting, is really has an impact on entrepreneurship and the economy. We know from research done by Dr. Lisa Cook that closing the patenting gaps would increase the annual GDP by $1 trillion. That's a lot. IWPR also dug into this impact, specifically looking at intellectual property rights and the impact that it have on business outcomes for women-owned businesses. And what does that look like when you compare women-owned businesses to men-owned businesses? The first thing we should keep in mind is that women are making up an increasing share of all businesses. Women-owned businesses are growing at rates nearly 4 times as fast as men-owned businesses. And a lot of this is actually driven by women of color. And while intellectual property rights are not particularly common among business owners in general, so if you think of the whole scope of businesses, when we look at patenting and IP rights, so trademarks, copyrights, all of those, there is still a gender gap. Women-owned businesses are less likely than their male-owned counterparts to own any sort of intellectual property rights. And patents tend to be concentrated in industries where there are few women-owned businesses. If you look at specifically patents granted and patents pending, men-owned businesses owned by men are twice as likely to have that kind of intellectual property as women-owned businesses. At the same time, when we look at the data, women-owned businesses that have at least a patent pending have average revenues of more than 16 times higher than those without IP holdings. While IP is not the sole cause of higher revenues, it's a part of the story. We also know from research that IP holdings really help to attract startup capital, which means women-owned businesses are sorely affected when it comes to looking at starting your business. Women-owned businesses have more limited access to startup capital and are less likely to get VC funds. When you look at it broken down by different brackets, men-owned businesses are twice as likely to have $1 million or more in startup capital than women-owned businesses. This is a huge gap. The good news is there are a number of programs that are working across the United States that are dedicated to increasing diversity in patenting, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Some of my research that was released in 2018 looked into these programs, mainly because while there are a lot of programs out there, there's actually little known about the various efforts and what makes them successful, what makes them succeed in what they're trying to do into closing these gaps. We dug into this a little bit more, and we conducted in-depth interview with 7 programs and a few of the program participants. And though each program in a different area, some of them were working connected to universities, some of the programs were part of associations. So the AWIS program, they had their STEM to market. We looked at Phase 0 program for the Department of Energy. So across different areas as well, they did have some common strategies that helped make them successful in getting more diversity in innovation and entrepreneurship. One of the first strategies is information sharing and education. So to address the lack of education on patenting and commercialization, most of the programs placed a major emphasis on education, just sharing knowledge. A lot of them had a structured curriculum, or they got this information one-on-one advice, or they had seminar-based instruction. These programs also really emphasize network building and mentorship. And my research that I'll get into next really shows why this is the case. A common theme that surfaced was that many women lack the networks and sponsors needed to take their innovation from idea to market. Again, informal networks are key to connecting people with resources, specifically women and women of color who often lacked the immediate contacts to make these connections. So these programs really focused on helping women build their networks. These programs, surprisingly, one of the great things that I really was pleased to learn was that they also focused on changing the culture. All these programs really worked to foster broader cultural change within their ecosystem. They took part in awareness raising campaigns. They spoke about the importance of diversity to broader audience, including, if they're at university, students and faculty and staff. They talked to stakeholders in local communities. They talked to investors. They really did the extra step of making sure people understood how important this topic is. Each of the programs also had metrics. They tracked their outcomes. They either formally or informally tracked specific data points and had concrete goals by which to measure their program success. And if they felt like they weren't meeting those, they made changes. They said, what's going on here? They dug into it. A lot of these programs, I will say, were started or had researchers as a big part of their component. So these are all people who are very interested in understanding what makes them successful. And I think that in of itself helped them be successful. So I'll move on to our most recent research. All of our previous research didn't really show the whys of the patenting gap. So we dug into this a little bit further. And I'll give you a quick overview of our most recent findings that were actually released just last week. And again, this is just a quick overview. This is a qualitative study, so please go visit the website. There's numerous quotes and stories that I won't have time to get into today from those that we interviewed. So our research project started out with the aim of discovering what are the challenges and systemic barriers for women, particularly women of color, during the patenting process, as well as what are the most crucial supports and who are the gatekeepers that help women and women of color successfully patent their ideas. So we conducted 21 in-depth interviews with 16 women 11 of whom were women of color, and 5 men. Kind of wanted to just see how the stories changed with men and what men were seeing in this space as well. So what did we find when we spoke to these women? The first key takeaway is that women continually face systemic barriers to innovation and patenting. Every single woman we interviewed shared multiple stories of the ways that stereotypes, bias, and discrimination impacted them and their careers throughout. Some reported experiencing, sexual harassment even from peers, colleagues, and even investors. We had stories that the women shared from us that, the seemingly benign stories of people just kind of undermining them, questioning them, walking into a conference. Oh, who invented that? That's so cool. I did. I'm listed as the inventor. To even patent attorneys who made women go through a whole host of proving that their idea was worthy, even if they came from a corporation and the corporation had said, yes, you need to go patent this. It's just numerous stories of women facing this time and time again. As well as, one entrepreneur who has 2 male co-founders told us the story of they went to go do a due diligence meeting with an investor, and the investor asked specifically to her, so what's going on here? Is this a 3-way relationship? She said that would have never been a question if she were a man. So all sorts of stories of the barriers. And these are all women who are successful in getting patents. These women range from having 1 patent to some of them had 80 or 90 patents and were prolific inventors. And not one of them said, oh no, I never faced any of that. This is especially true for women of color in the STEM fields. They often experience additional race gender biases. A lot of them spoke about the difficulty of overcoming biases because they were often the only one in the room. They were the only woman of color. They really faced a lot of kind of feelings of, I have to be better, I have to do better, and I have to, speak on behalf of all women or women of color. I am the representative. We know from research that women who are the only in the room are more likely to have negative experiences, and including having their abilities challenged by their peers. And most of the women and all of the men who we interviewed attributed some of the lack of diversity in patenting to the lack of women of color in STEM. This lack of gender and racial diversity in the field comes even as women continue to graduate with STEM degrees at increasingly high rates. So what we heard a lot of are, again, a testament to the structural barriers in the workplace that keep women from advancing in their careers at the same rate as men. We heard a lot of issues around work-life balance that are specifically focused on, women's issues such as having children, women being pushed off career paths because they might have children. Oh, you shouldn't go into research. You shouldn't go into patent-intensive fields. If you want to have kids, that's just not, it's not going to be feasible. Again, these are things that were said to the women and never to the men. And this can really, hinder a woman's career or push them out of STEM altogether. Another thing that a lot of the women, that actually all of the patent holders talked about, was the lack of formal education on the patenting system and process. But this especially adversely impacted women. 5 of the women reported that they didn't understand what constituted an invention when they first began. They didn't understand that what they were doing was inventing even. And a number of women spoke about the lack of formal education meant that they also did not know where to even start to find resources about patenting. I mean, they were like Googling things and they had no idea, no clue, anything about the patent process. This oftentimes continually follows women, and the lack of education leads to confusion throughout the patenting process, including what it means to receive a rejection from the USPTO. Many said they didn't understand when a rejection was truly a rejection and when it was an opportunity to refine and resubmit an idea. This follows women throughout their careers. We had a couple women say, I write patents now, we've had multiple patents granted even, and I still get confused. I still don't understand. I'm still constantly learning. It's kind of a black box, and depending on where you're going with things, you have to learn new things all the time. This means that informal education and mentoring is essential to women's success. And yet women have to work harder to build networks and find mentors. 14 of the 16 women we interviewed said they felt like they had to work twice as hard to find resources, mentors, and networks to help them succeed. Many of these women said, I have networks now, but I have to continually find it for myself. I have to work harder. I have to go through longer processes to find the people I really need to get me where I need to go, which means that gatekeepers matter. They can be the difference between success and failure, especially for young, new inventors. We heard a lot of stories about how supervisors and academic advisors really helped to ensure that women, and particularly women of color, get credit on patents. Oftentimes when you're a new inventor, we heard that you're not even in the room if you're on a team, when that patent application and who is going forward on who's going to be on it as an inventor. So having someone in the room to really advocate on your behalf really meant the difference between being a patented inventor and not. We even heard a story of a woman who said, I found out about patenting because I was Googling it, and I found out my advisor had patented our idea without me. And I said, what is this patenting? And I need to know more. So it really can make or break women's patenting success early in their careers. And again, patenting attorneys and technology transfer offices are also gatekeepers in the area. I know we're running up against time, so I'll just go quickly through this. We did interviews with women inventors in all different settings: academia, corporate, and entrepreneurship. And there are unique barriers in every single one of those settings. I'll talk a little bit about the entrepreneurship. I'm sure there's no surprise here that the main challenge is funding. Given the cost of quality patent attorneys, limited access to pro bono services, the cost of defending IP rights, funding for the patenting process becomes a financial burden for many entrepreneurs who are trying to take their innovation and build a company around it. At the same time, the lack of venture capital investments and seed money that goes to startups led by white women, and specifically women of color, means they're less likely to have the capital needed to patent and commercialize their ideas. The gender and racial wage and wealth gaps really play a part here, because it means that these women don't have their own savings, their family as investors, to kind of fill any of these funding gaps from outside sources. So even for women who successfully patent their inventions, there are huge barriers along the way that make the process more onerous and difficult, and can push many women off the path altogether. At the intersection of gender and race, women of color face additional constant barriers in patent-intensive fields. Tackling these issues will really take a concerted effort from a wide range of individuals, from organizations, corporations, academic institutions, including policymakers. There's a lot of space. That is actually the good news. There are multiple entry points where policymakers, corporations, and academic institutions can work to make change, and even individuals can jump in. So I know we have a whole other host of sessions. There are lots of policy recommendations in the reports. I really encourage you to go and find out more about them.
We are running a little bit behind time, but I think there was just so much there that we should save room for at least maybe one general question from our first panel. And it's hard to kind of summarize everything that we've just heard about. Like, for one, for me at least, there was just a tremendous amount of alarm and pessimism, but also a tremendous amount of hope, because there are opportunities to fix and resolve and address some of these issues. And so I would just be curious to get maybe a quick response from everyone, and Elise kind of did this at the end, thinking about what are some specific things that people can do, and maybe also highlight just a common misconception that people might have about what can be done.
I guess I could throw in to echo something that Elise brought up repeatedly with the idea of gatekeepers. So we see this in the Inclusion Impact Index data, which is, if you look by industry, certain industries are considerably worse for women than others. And interestingly, they on surface seem completely different. for example, banking and entertainment. But what those two have in common is they are both very hierarchical, one informally and one formally. And we find highly hierarchical industries, whether formal or informal, tend to be very bad for non-traditional entrepreneurs. Essentially, where there is a gatekeeper, even if the true discrimination is only done by a relative small number, I think we can all appreciate one man in Hollywood can do a lot of damage, as we've all seen. So, so we see this a lot, whereas in industries like biotech and artificial intelligence that are much more emerging and don't have the same sort of barriers to entry just historically in place, there are much better opportunities. So in that sense, San Diego, with its significant biotech industry, the female entrepreneurs there on average do much better than female entrepreneurs in San Francisco. The economy of female entrepreneurship in San Francisco is much larger, but the specific industries represented in San Diego appears to be more supportive. And I'll go a little bit further and even say something perhaps a touch controversial, which is there's a lot of industry ghetto effects. You know, if you're a female entrepreneur, we'll actually overfund you for fashion, but we'll give you less for anything else. If you're Black, we'll overfund you for a sports or entertainment startup. If you're gay, man, we'll overfund you for a lifestyle startup, but anything else you get less. So now we have these incentives pushing people into certain outcomes. And it turns out actually by industry, fashion, lifestyle, and entertainment are not great industries to do a startup in. So all of those high growth billion-dollar outcomes are in cutting edge emerging technologies, not in those three industries. And yet we incentivize non-traditional entrepreneurs to go there. And again, gatekeeper behavior in those industries and within cities creates real disincentives. So I think that gives us both. We can see places where there are problems and we could tackle that, the specific forms of discrimination within problem areas, and we can look at areas where there are true opportunities for growth. Because I will say this, even though Houston and San Diego have on average much better outcomes for female entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurship rates are still relatively low in those metros for women. So if we could just encourage greater degrees of queer, female, and other groups to go into entrepreneurship within certain domains, we could see real explosive growth there as indicated in the data. But right now, all the incentives are quite perverse.
I'll just pile on here a little bit that one of the lessons for me of COVID and some of these issues, Derek, you mentioned that there's a lot to be concerned about and depressed about, and one could potentially despair. But I really believe, and this is not based on my research, but I believe that hope is a choice and optimism is a choice. And I know my co-author on a bunch of my work, Eric Brynjolfsson, would echo that the outcomes of technological change and the future of work are a choice. And so what we can't do is sit back and just watch this play out, is that we all have to intentionally design processes and organizations and incentives that are aware and inclusive, and we can construct the future we want to live in if we educate ourselves and we take action every chance we get within the reach of our arm. And that's something we can't sort of take a pass on.
I think a lot of so I'll say kind of two things that I feel like are interconnected, in that I hear a lot of, through our research, talking to people on this, is that, it's a pipeline issue. We can't find the talent. We don't have the people. And I'll just say it's categorically untrue. the people are out there, the ideas are out there. I truly believe in the many years that I've been doing this research and talking to people, and I'm a qualitative researcher, so that's my arm of this, where I go out and I really, I do focus groups and I do interviews and I talk to the people that are out there. And while the people kind of, I would say in the positions of power, oftentimes are like, no, it's a pipeline issue. I always come back with it. It's a structural barriers issue. And like I said, they're just at so many different levels and so many different places along the way. There are ways to address this. And I think that's the good news. I think for me, a lot of times our research comes across, as you said, as like kind of this depressing, like, oh my God, this is so negative. But for me, I look at all of those are opportunities. All of those are opportunities for individuals, for companies, for institutions, for policymakers to step in and be proactive and make change. And I think that for me is the good news and the ray of hope. And I think even as individuals, it's about getting involved. Be the voice. You have the information now. Bring these things up at your own workplace. Bring these things up within your own communities. Find who's if you are a person who has resources, if you're a patent attorney, if you're, whoever you are, find those groups that are already working on this in your area, get involved, be a mentor, figure out how you can plug those gaps as an individual, and then how you can kind of spread it, how you can be that voice for change, get involved with policy and activism activities. There's a great group, Invent Together, who we've been working with throughout our many years, and they're really pushing for policy change, and they love more people to come and join.
Thank you all so much again. As I ride this roller coaster of emotions, I'm back up on a little bit of a high note, so I appreciate. Please stay engaged with us as we move now to hearing from some more speakers as we kind of dive down a little deeper. And for that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for this second panel. Dr. William Lloyd Duncan, Assistant Professor of Mathematics and Statistics at Baker University.
Great, thanks, Derek. First, let me just apologize for the background noise here. For whatever reason, the internet is out at my office, and so I've come to a coffee shop. But I want to introduce the next two panelists here. We're in the Designing Equitable Innovation Programs and Policies, and we're going to hear from Dr. Alex Bell, postdoctoral research scholar at the CA Policy Lab at UCLA, and Professor Matt Marx from Cornell University. So Alex, if you are ready, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks for having me. There's been a lot to think about so far in this forum, and it's really amazing and exciting work that we've heard so far. My name is Alex. I'm a postdoc at the California Policy Lab at UCLA. This is joint work I'll be sharing today with Raj Chetty, Xavier Neviana, John Van Reenen, many co-authors who can't be here today, unfortunately, but the work is on who becomes an inventor in America. We'll be focusing on the importance of exposure to innovation also. So this is a quantitative study that is linking several vast data sets together. It's a big data exercise. The main starting data set we'll be looking at is the US Patent and Trademark database of 1.2 million inventors from roughly 1980 to present. We'll be linking this data set to US tax records, administrative data that's going to give us information on inventors' gender. It'll let us link US inventors to their parents so that we can understand what types of socioeconomic backgrounds inventors come from. And then finally, for certain analyses, we'll also bring in some school district data, which we have for a subsample of the inventors, which will let us see their test scores and self-reported race for the sample also. So diving right into the analysis, this is one of the most striking results to me. It's actually a result Dr. Ming previewed also. What we've done here is we've ranked all the kids in the United States according to their parents' income percentile here on the horizontal axis. And then what we've looked at is the likelihood that the kid grows up to become an inventor later in life based on their parents' income. And what we see here is a tremendous income gradient. Essentially, kids who are born to parents in the top 1% of the parent income distribution are about 10 times as likely to grow up to become inventors as kids born to below median parents. So huge disparities by parent income here. We also see disparities by race in the sample for which we have self-reported race. So we see white children are about 3 times as likely to file a patent as Black children, for instance. Very low rates of patenting among Hispanic children. Asian children are a group with a high rate of patenting. And then, the final disparity to highlight here is that by gender, which, others have talked about. Also, I know Elyse has done really great work on this also. One way that I like to think about this is by the birth cohort of the inventor, which we can see from the linkage to the tax data. And, it's actually the case that with each new cohort of inventors, the gender gap is closing somewhat. We're sort of inching toward gender parity among the latest generations of inventors. But of the youngest generation of inventors, still only about 18% of the youngest inventors are women. At the current trend, if you sort of extrapolate this rate of growth, we're talking about probably on the order of 100 years to reach gender parity in patenting, which is, it's a troublingly slow, I think, rate of convergence. So that's a high level overview of the disparities. Our next question is, what's causing these disparities? Is there any evidence that differences in talents could explain this gap, or the alternative hypothesis that, preview will end up sort of shining light on is there lost innovation? Are there these lost Einsteins out there, lost Marie Curies out there, talented youth who seem like they have the potential to innovate, if not for societal barriers affecting these groups? So the way that we'll do this analysis is we'll bring in some of the test score data. And one result that was quite surprising to me, actually, here I've plotted patent rates in adulthood against a 3rd grade childhood math test score. And what's so surprising is even as young as 3rd grade, math test scores are actually surprisingly predictive of who's going to go on to file a patent at the US Patent and Trademark Office. And essentially what you see is, the patenting rates are very low until you hit something like 2 standard deviations out on math test scores. So there's a lot of predictive content in this. But what's really troubling is that it's a pattern that's basically true for, let's say, kids from more privileged backgrounds. In this case, I'm looking at kids from higher income parents as opposed to kids from lower income parents. What we see is talented children are much more likely to become inventors, not only if they have high test scores, but even conditional on having high, talents, also coming from a high income parent background. And we see similar gaps also. You could draw similar pictures by gender and by race. There are a lot of these disparities that really persist even after looking at differences in these aptitude measures, even at young ages. So it's suggestive that we are in this case of having a lot of lost potential innovation that we're leaving on the table. Lost Einsteins, lost Marie Curies, as you'll call it. So if women, people of color, and children from low-income families, if you could somehow wave a magic wand and make this world such that they're innovating at the same rate as, essentially high-income white men, the magnitude of these gaps is such that the innovation rate in America would quadruple. So that's a way that we can think about the magnitude of these disparities. They're really big. If we could close these disparities, we could get as much as 4 times as many inventors in America today as we have currently. And I should also say there's a really rapidly growing body of work on these topics. I think the first part of the panel was a great, a great survey of that. So much emerging qualitative work also. It's really, really exciting. I was saying to Elyse before, it's really exciting to see so much work getting done. The next part of the work, we sort of move on to measuring in the quantitative data a specific potential policy lever here. Does childhood exposure to innovation hold promise as a way for remedying these gaps? So in asking whether exposure to innovation matters, in today's talk, I'm going to operationalize this question in a certain way in the quantitative data, but I think it's really good to take a variety of approaches, and some of the qualitative literature has weighed in on this too. For today's talk, I'll really just be proxying for exposure as growing up in a city where there are a lot of inventors. And what we're going to ask is, does growing up in a city where there are a lot of inventors seem to have a causal effect on getting kids to become inventors themselves? And the finding is going to be essentially, yes, children who are raised around more inventors are more likely to invent themselves, which is suggestive of this channel of exposure effects. So let me walk you through how we find this. This is a map showing patent rates, but rather than looking at the patent rate where people live at the time of the patent, we're actually plotting the patent rate among kids who grow up in these cities, even if they patent later in life. And what we're seeing here is there are some places that are very good at essentially raising the next generation of inventors. On the West Coast, we've got San Francisco and San Jose, Minneapolis, Madison, Wisconsin, Detroit. One pattern that kind of stands out to you here, which I'll show on the next slide more formally, is the places that tend to be good at raising a lot of inventors also tend to be the places that have a lot of adult inventors around. And that's what we show here in the form of a scatter plot, where I've one dot per city, and I've plotted on the horizontal axis the number of adult inventors in that city when the kid was young. And on the vertical axis, we have the outcome of that map, which is essentially, how many inventors are they producing in that city? And what we see in general, there's a pattern that, San Jose grows a lot of inventors, but they also have a lot of inventors there, as opposed to a city like Brownsville, Texas, for instance, which is on the other end of the spectrum, not producing many inventors, but also, and it doesn't have that many inventors around as adults. So this is a correlation. I think it's an interesting suggestive correlation, and it's consistent with exposure effects mattering for innovation. But we do a few extra pieces now to really try to push for causality and test how much of that correlation might be causal. The first way we do this is with a movers design. So what we see here is we conclude that neighborhoods causally affect future innovation, and the way that we do this is by looking at two kids who move to different areas. Let's say that Brownsville, Texas versus San Jose. And we find that the more years that a kid is spending in San Jose, for instance, the more likely the kid is to innovate. And with each year that a kid spends in a higher innovation place, that increases the chances of innovating even more. And we think that about something like 75% of the cross-sectional pattern can be sort of accounted for by this causal exposure effect using the movers design. And while the movers design is useful for establishing general causal effects of places, it doesn't indicate so much the mechanism of the effect. It doesn't rule out, for instance, that a place like San Jose may grow a lot of inventors mostly because it has a good school system or something like that, as opposed to the exposure to inventors effect. So what we do to better understand the mechanism of the effect is to look at whether the exposure effects that we're detecting are in some sense technology specific. Because if they are technology specific, that rules out these broad sort of general human capital theories. So the way that we'll do this, again, think about comparing two inventors, but let's say they're both living in they're both growing up in a high innovation place. Let's say one grows up in the Silicon Valley and one grows up in Minneapolis. And, I live in Boston now, so perhaps they've moved to Boston. It's not really important. But the important part is the one who's growing up in Silicon Valley, we're going to find is more likely, for instance, to patent in computers. And incidentally, there are a lot of more adult computer inventors in Silicon Valley. And in contrast, the one who is growing up in Minneapolis, not only is he or she more likely to file a patent, but in particular, this person is more likely to file a patent in medical devices. And that might speak to something about growing up near the Mayo Clinic, growing up near medical device inventors. So we find that these patterns are technology class specific. And then the last result I'm going to share before wrapping up and moving on is they're actually even gender specific. And this is important too to understand. So what we see here is when we look at the likelihood of becoming an inventor for young boys and for young girls separately, we find that for young boys, it's important to have adult male inventors around. And in contrast, for young girls, it's the flip story. It's important to have adult female inventors around. That's how the correlation loads. And then it doesn't load onto the sort of opposite gender. So this is the last result I wanted to share. I want to sort of just conclude and summarize the broader discussion and findings. The analysis shows that there's evidence for many lost Einsteins, lost Marie Curies, a lot of talented kids who have the potential to innovate, but don't do so for some sort of societal factors. These gaps are big. If we could somehow close the gaps in patenting by gender, race, and parent income, we would have as many as 4 times as many inventors. We're leaving a lot of innovation on the table here. And then we've also shown that there's an importance here of early exposure to childhood innovation, which is a resource that is not equally distributed. Not everyone has access to exposure to innovation, to the mentors and the networks and the various things one might learn from that. And we've also found in this last slide, there's some evidence that gender-specific exposure makes a difference here, which I think speaks to this saying that often comes to mind. You can't be what you can't see. It's important to have mentors, role models that are like you here. Also, I think that's another potential policy implication that comes from this study. So that's what this analysis shows here. I'll just put in one quick shameless plug for other upcoming related work to watch out for. We are looking now with the team at UCLA that I'm a part of now to understand how the pandemic has affected this whole innovation landscape and access to opportunities, and also looking to merge this with some of the strands on the unemployment insurance literature to understand how some of the unemployment insurance expansions during the pandemic may have contributed to patterns of access to innovation. So thanks very much. I'll turn it over to the other presenters.
And Professor Marx, if you're ready, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to share some thoughts today. I want to start by thanking the very generous sponsors of this work, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and the National Science Foundation. I also need to share a disclaimer, which is that some of the results I'll share today use data from the confidential data from the IRS and the US Census Bureau. So although they defend to the death my right to share these results, they do not endorse them in any way. Okay. Now, today's theme is the role of entrepreneurship in creating equitable and inclusive prosperity. But what we're really talking about, I think, is high potential entrepreneurship. Not that restaurants and dry cleaners don't create jobs, but if we think about Ewing Marion Kauffman himself, and he started out as a pharmaceutical salesman. In fact, was so successful that he had earned more than the CEO of the company he worked for, who then wanted to cut his sales commission. Ewing then quit and set up his own company, Marion Labs, which was then fabulously successful, led to the founding of the foundation that's sponsoring today's event. That's high potential entrepreneurship. Another example is the founder of the university that now employs me, Ezra Cornell, who didn't invent the telegraph, but made it actually work. So it was Samuel Morse who invented the telegraph, who stapled telegraph wire to telegraph poles, but the signal kept dying. And Ezra's innovation was to take those telegraph wires and embed them inside glass tubes so that the signal kept going, and ran them from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Baltimore to Manhattan, Manhattan to Albany, to Buffalo, to Chicago, and that's how he made his millions. And it's high potential entrepreneurship, which I want to focus on today, that creates jobs, creates wealth, creates power. And that's what we want to bring to more people. If you look at this slide, too much of those high potential startups are concentrated among the sorts of people you see on this slide. That is, white males. In fact, but don't take just anecdotal examples, look at the data. This is data from PitchBook through, I think, the 14th of July, a couple of weeks ago. This is worldwide venture-backed startups. And what I've done here is I've calculated the percent of those that have at least one female founder. And the sad news is that 80% of venture-backed startups around the globe have all male founders. Now, in 20 years ago, it was about 12, 13%. We're up to almost 20% that have at least one female founder. It actually took a dip in 2021. But if you're looking for a gender gap in entrepreneurship, there you go. You don't have to rely on anecdotal data. You're looking at real data. Now, there have been a lot of studies to try to explain why this gap is happening, and most of those studies have focused on individual discrimination. My favorite of these studies is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Brooks et al., what they did is they took the same PowerPoint deck, gave it to male entrepreneurs and female entrepreneurs to pitch that, had investors listen to these pitches, and who do you think got the money? And so this has been documented many, many, many times. But individual discrimination is difficult to deal with. You're dealing with deep-seated biases, ingrained tendencies that are tough to change. I want to shift the lens a little bit to what Deva and Pager, in a brilliant article in the Journal of Economic Literature in 2020, this is by two sociologists writing for economists, refer to as institutional discrimination. That is, policies and practices that may not have even been intended to discriminate against women or underrepresented minorities, but nonetheless did so. That's bad news. What's the good news? The good news is that policies can change, laws can change very quickly. And if we can identify those sources of discrimination, we can make changes. And so I want to talk about just one of those that is an example of an unintended consequence that could be changed. And that is an employee non-compete agreement. Now, rather than describe what a non-compete agreement is, I want to show you one. And in fact, show you a non-compete agreement that I signed when I finished college. Now, when I finished college, this was a long time ago. I'm an old person. And I was fairly naive. I interviewed for my first job at a startup. I was employee number 5, and I was fairly naive. I forgot to ask questions such as, are you about to miss payroll? I forgot to ask questions like, if I join this company, will you ask me to promise not to work at any other company in this industry for 2 years? But that's precisely what they asked me to do. Mr. Marx hereby covenants not to work for any company in the speech recognition industry, that's my background, automatic speech recognition, anywhere in the world for a period of 2 years after leaving Applied Language Technologies. Now, this is a non-compete agreement, and in 1995, this was legal in Massachusetts. Today, this is illegal. You can't have a 2-year non-compete anymore. And moreover, more importantly, you can't ambush an employee with a non-compete their first day at work. But that's exactly what happened to me. Welcome, Matt. Here's your 401k, direct deposit, health insurance, and your non-compete. I was like, what? And I didn't know any lawyers. I'd turned down all my other job offers. It was sign it and work here, or don't sign it and go find another job. So what choice did I really have? That's illegal now in Massachusetts and Oregon and New Hampshire and a handful of other states. But it actually is up to the states. But if you sign one of these like I did, now you can't go join another company. You can't found another startup. And if you do, you can't hire other people with expertise because they might be subject to a non-compete. But importantly, and you're wondering, where does the institution come in? It's because the states enforce these employment agreements. Now, there are some exceptions. California famously does not allow non-compete agreements, never has, since it was incorporated as a state. North Dakota, Oklahoma, and there are shades of gray or green. This is a report I did for the Brookings Institution a few years ago. And as of 2 Fridays ago, the White House issued an executive order stating its intent, asking the FTC to look into the possibility of regulating non-competes at the national level. Now, I'm not an attorney. I don't understand whether the FTC has the authority to do this. One of the commissioners of the FTC expressed concern whether the FTC has the authority to do this. I don't know. It's very interesting. What I do know is that non-competes do make it harder for people to leave their jobs and start a company that draws upon their own expertise. Now, so far, you might believe that, but you might wonder, well, what does that have to do with women? Stay with me for a second. Most startups fail. We know this for an empirical fact. And we also know that startups are less likely to fail if you start something in an area where you know what you're doing. So far, so good. But that's exactly what non-competes are designed to stop you from doing. And therefore, non-competes add legal risk to the already sizable business risk, because your ex-employer might sue you for breaking your non-compete by starting a rival business. Now, here's where the gender angle comes in. Using confidential census data, which I'll tell you about in a second, women start companies earlier in their career, about 3 years earlier on average, and having earned about $100,000 less on average than a man in the same very narrowly defined industry. So if they are sued by their former employer and have to defend themselves in court, because what happens is your ex-employer, they don't sue your new employer, they sue you personally. You have to defend yourself. And thus your relative costs of mounting a legal defense are higher because you have less money in the bank. Moreover, we know from excellent research by Heather Sarsons at UChicago, for example, that women are penalized more harshly for failure. She did a great study of cardiologists. Now, if you're a heart surgeon, not every patient survives. Sometimes you take on a patient who is at death's door, but you do the operation anyway, not much you can do. When a female cardiologist loses a patient, they also lose referrals. Those referrals dry up. Why is that? Her paper shows that women pay more of a penalty. Similar findings in financial institutions when corruption arises. I also find, using the census data, that when entrepreneurs, when their companies fail and they go back to look for regular jobs, women pay more of a wage penalty. Also, when women return to work after a spell of unemployment, they pay more of a wage penalty. And so what non-competes do is they increase the risk of failure in entrepreneurship, increase the cost of failure, and thus discourage women from starting companies where a non-compete lawsuit might arise. That's the theory. Let's look at the empirics. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use data from the IRS and the US Census. Now, if I were a census employee, I could see the whole country. I'm not. I did do the FBI fingerprinted background check, so I can see about half the country. And what I can do is I can look at people who did their entire career inside these green states, that's half the country, or who moved from one of the green states to another green state. But if they left a green state for a gray state, which I can't see, I got to throw them out entirely. So I moved from about 70 million people to about 6 million people, but I can see every place they ever worked, every company they ever founded. And then I can compare states with stricter non-competes and less strict non-competes for the sake of identifying the difference in founding rates. So what do I find? The first thing I can do is I can replicate prior studies, about 5 of them, that show that non-competes discourage founding new companies. And that's not new. We've known that for years. What we haven't known previously is the gender effect, which is that non-competes discourage women from founding startups about to a 15% greater degree than for men. That's new. Here's what's even more disturbing. When women nonetheless start companies, and this is, by the way, companies in the same industry as their prior company, as their prior employer, that's where the non-competes make a difference. They're less likely to hire people with industry experience, and especially reluctant to reach out to people they used to work with in the same industry. Now, why would that be? I speculate they may be less willing not only to put themselves at the risk of a lawsuit, but less willing to put their colleagues at risk of a lawsuit. Now, I can't verify that because your Social Security numbers are scrambled. Your Census Bureau does a great job of disguising this data, so I can't interview anyone, but that could be possible. But here's the most disturbing thing. When women nonetheless found startups despite the risk of the non-compete, what they don't do is they don't found high potential ventures. Why? Because these are the high risk ventures. And that's what non-competes do. you can't, it's more risky to hire people with that industry experience. And so these are the ventures that it's just not worth taking the risk. And so why is this happening? If you talk to an employment attorney, they'll say, well, wait a second. I do this for a living. If you go before the judge will do the right thing. This will be okay in court, but I don't think that's the right answer, because it's really the chilling effect. There just aren't that many lawsuits. Barely 2/1000th of the workforce gets sued in a given year. It's not about the lawsuits. It's about the cease and desist letters, the verbal threats. You signed a non-compete. Don't you go. And I've done enough field work to hear plenty of horror stories of people who never got sued, but were told they might get sued, or people who worried they might get sued. In fact, I counted the lawsuits and found that on average, women are not sued as often as men. But there's a huge body of research suggesting that women tend to be more risk averse. And so this may be why women don't start companies as often as men, when the non-competes are more enforceable, and why they don't hire their former colleagues who could get sued as often. And that's why it's not enough for the court or the judge to do the right thing. It's why we need to not just help the judge do the right thing. It's why we need to ban employers from asking workers to sign non-competes. Now, my time's up. I need to wrap up. But just to conclude, non-competes block women from starting not just startups, but starting high potential startups, where they use their own industry experience, where they hire others that have industry experience. And this reinforces unfortunate stereotypes that women found low growth lifestyle businesses. So if we ban the use of non-competes, we can advance the agenda of this session to promote inclusive prosperity. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks for listening.
Great. Thanks so much, Professor Marx. We have a couple of questions that have come in through the Q&A, and so I just want to synthesize those and present them to our panelists. Two for Dr. Bell and one for Professor Marx. So Dr. Bell, could you talk a little bit about what kinds of preconditions are good for innovation and entrepreneurship? One of the questions talked specifically about the impact of conflict. And then could you also talk a little bit about the coupling effect between a parent's occupation and the field that the child goes on to innovate in? And I'll just go ahead and give the other one for Professor Marx as well. So we have one here about the sort of power imbalances. So racial discrimination can create power for some and leaving others powerless. And so could you address how that might impact the digital innovation business a little bit? So Dr. Bell, why don't you go first?
Yeah, so regarding inventors in war-torn areas, or encouraging innovation in war-torn areas with conflict, I don't have much directly related to that I've seen out there, but if you're interested, I'm actually involved with a group that is aiming to provide innovation education to youth experiencing homelessness in parts of Chicago, which, you know, it's not exactly what you're asking for. But I'm happy to connect you with that group if that's of interest. And the second question about the interaction between the place and the parent's occupation. Yeah, so that's certainly something that we have studied in the paper also. In today's slides, I was mostly, you know, just for brevity, operationalizing exposure as exposure through the place. But in the paper, we do a lot of analysis actually also looking at exposure through either the parent being an inventor, you know, oneself. So the innovation rate among kids whose parents are inventors is really quite high. But more generally, looking at the innovation rate among kids whose parents work in a more or less innovative industry, even if the parent is not actually an inventor. And we do certainly find there that kids whose parents are working in an innovative industry are more likely to invent also. And, you know, we sort of view that as a similar mechanism, you know, to the extent that it's increasing the chances that a kid might come into contact with an inventor, you know, in the daily routines, you know, either through a parent or through some some other type of social network. So I think that those are probably both channels that I would say, we've measured exposure by it, and I think both channels matter.
Professor Marx, do you want to take the question about the power imbalances for racial discrimination or gender discrimination?
So there's so I didn't mention this, but I've done, so before I got my PhD, I did 3 different startups in the voice recognition industry, and I think that I don't know, I almost don't feel qualified to answer the question, because I have such an easy background, I mean, like I'll give you an example of this. Like when I was like, someone pointed out to me a couple of years ago that I'm a 2nd-gen college student, right? That both of my parents were 1st-gen college students. Like my mom grew up picking potatoes in Idaho for 50 cents a day, and my dad grew up on a farm milking cows, and his guidance counselor told him, like, wow, you're really smart. Maybe you should, like, you get a job at the smelter someday. Then he like goes and gets a PhD in electrical engineering, and he designed the lunar camera for the Apollo mission. Like, holy cow. Like if you've seen like Neil Armstrong step on the moon, my dad built the camera for that. Like, what the heck? And like, I'm a 2nd-gen college student, and I never thought about that, because like it never affected my life. Like my life is easy. Like I have no concept of what it would mean to be a 1st-gen college student. You know what I mean? Because I'm like, the difference from 0 to 1 is massive, and the difference from 1 to 2 is like this. You know what I mean? So I'm just so far removed from the experience that someone would have that I feel almost unqualified to ask. That's to comment on something like this. So I feel like my role is more to like do a study along these lines that can provide data to like aggregate data to show what's going on, and kind of same sort of thing that Alex is doing. I almost don't want to make policy suggestions that would be uninformed. You know what I mean? I don't mean to punt, but I'm just like, I feel like there's people better qualified to actually say what should be done.
I actually have a follow-up question, if that's okay, probably for Alex. So you have a lot on sort of deterministic factors in where entrepreneurship and innovation patents are happening. Have you looked into kind of interventions, like, for instance, if there are universities with incubators or different kinds of entrepreneurship centers, does that make a difference in access? Or
it's something I'd love to do, but I haven't done much. I think the general question here are what so we see in this broad micro data that exposure to innovation seems like an important tool. Now, how can we get more of that? And I think the broader question is, what particular programs or policies are kind of most effective. And I think, we're really sort of at the early stages of answering that question. And, it was actually, so I can't ask questions as a panelist, but if I could, I would have asked, in some of Elise's work in the qualitative section, is there any qualitative work sort of describing what programs and policies are more effective here? But I think that what we need really is, sort of more, I mean, from my perspective as a quantitative researcher, we need more quantitative evaluations of there are many different programs out there that seek to expose kids to innovation, either after school, during school, in the summer. I think that we need many more sort of, ideally randomized control trial evaluations of these things. The problem is, it's very hard because it takes time. If you really want to understand how does an invention on a 10-year-old impact innovation 20, 30 years later, I mean, that's something that you really have to set in motion early on. And then you talk about, sort of what proxy outcomes you can use. I think that we're getting there with the research, but it's a slow process. It's just starting out.
I think Kristen and Karen's questions here are related. Kristen is asking about this desire, no desire to build a venture, but they can sell the idea. So awareness of the process of patenting. And then Karen is also thinking about encouraging potential entrepreneurs in areas of the country that were not dark blue. I think those are kind of interrelated. questions. So Alex or Matt, do you want to take that on?
So in terms of encouraging entrepreneurship in general, yeah, I'll happily take that on. So I think that so entrepreneurship is still often seen as a very risky thing to do. And it's like a later in life thing you should do, like go, get your safe job out of college. But there are no safe jobs, right? I mean, it used to be that you would, you can work at IBM for 20 years, and then you can there are no safe jobs. Startups are, my first job out of college was a startup. And in some ways, startups are safer than big companies. Like you can be a star at a big company and you can get whacked. Divisions get sold off, shut down. And I don't think startups are as risky as people think they are. I think the risk at a startup is that you don't get the same certification of joining a big company on your resume, where people are like, oh, you worked at Amazon, I know what that means, versus I joined a small company you haven't heard of. And I think that's actually the thing people worry about. But I think they should worry a little less about that. And I was just talking to a student last night who interned at eBay. And now he's like, what should I do next year? And I'm like, you should work in a startup. And he's like, oh, but people won't know what that means. I'm like, I don't care. You should do that, because he wants to do his own startup someday. I don't know. I feel like it's a great experience and people should take the risk. But I understand the anxiety, and I understand that actually parental anxiety is a big part of it. And I'm happy to talk to parents.
So on these questions in particular about encouraging innovation among older folks, I think one thing that I've heard from the earlier panelists is sort of thinking through the structural barriers also is something that you might think. And also, economists like to debate the role of tax incentives, when you get into innovation among your sort of career choice among people who are more established. I think what some of my related work has shown is that the tax incentives might not really be as effective for a career like innovation, where the payoff is so uncertain already. It's not something that people would really plan for. So, I think understanding more about the structural barriers and how to remove them, that's what I'll chime in on here also.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I've done 3 startups and I never really thought about tax rates. Yeah.
That's good to know.
That's probably the end of our Q&A here. So shall we turn it back over to you, Derek?
Thank you everyone so much for attending today, and a special extra thanks to all of our presenters. It's been incredible to hear so much about not just the research, but the real stories and the experiences that provide both pause and hope. I think that, as highlighted earlier, that there's a lot here for us to think about in terms of what we can do to improve the current conditions and situations that we find ourselves in. So thank you all again. And as a reminder, this forum has been recorded, and we'll share the video in the future. And please note that our next forum is scheduled for August 26th. So please rejoin us next month when we'll be talking about supporting entrepreneurship, what are accelerators, and what is their role and impact. You'll have links to the registration available through the chat and also today's agenda. We'll be sharing more information about the upcoming forum and other events in our Insights to Entrepreneurship newsletter. So please make sure to sign up for that as well. We hope you can join us for future events. Thank you so much all again, and have a great day.